State lawmakers and political leaders are pushing back hard, including James McKim, president of the Manchester branch of the NAACP. He'll join me ahead along with UNH political science professor Dante Scala to talk about how the DNC is likely to respond. But first, more bad news for Boston public schools. At the end of a tumultuous year for the system, which came to the brink of a state takeover over deep-seated inequities and basic organizational failures, a new poll shows parents' satisfaction with BPS has taken a big hit in the past year. Less than a third of parents say they are very satisfied with the school district, according to the poll from the Mass Inc. polling group and the Shaw Foundation. That's down 10 points from last year. And even fewer black parents, just 19%, would say the same. So what does this mean for the ongoing problems that are plaguing BPS and the politicians charged with solving them? Joining me on those questions and a few other developments from the past week are GBH News City Hall reporter Soraya Wintersmith and managing editor of the Dorchester Reporter, Gin Dumpsius. Thank you both for being here. Soraya, the problems with BPS predate Michelle Wu's administration, but she has now been mayor for more than a year. Do you think that people who are frustrated with the state of BPS are also frustrated with her stewardship of the system?
Yeah, Adam, I think I would defer to someone who covers education deeply and regularly to kind of provide specific insight about what's evoking parents' dwindling satisfaction, as that Mass Inc. poll indicates. But just as a reporter, knowing that this is the fifth in a series that began last August and that parent satisfaction in the very satisfied tier was a little bit higher at that point, we almost have to assume that the slight decline has something to do with the year that Michelle Wu has been the steward of the system. The poll offers some clues about what may be driving that sense of dissatisfaction. Less than a third of those indicated that their children's buses are consistently running on time. And I think 40% expressed some sense of concern for their child's emotional and physical well-being while they're at school. I think I said when we were last together that entering into year two, all of the sorts of problems that precede Michelle Wu will come to rest on her. Yeah. And perhaps this poll is the beginning of an indication of that shift happening.
If you're worried about your kids getting to school on time, and if you're worried about their emotional well-being while they're at school, those are two big, pretty big concerns for parents to have. Gin, I know that, like Soraya, you cover politics. You're not an education reporter. But what's your sense of whether parents are now thinking of this as a Mayor Wu problem as opposed to a problem for the city generally?
Well, I think generally, if the numbers were released last week about, BPS seeing another drop in enrollment. People are voting with their feet. Yeah. And, if you look back from 10 years ago, we have now 9,000 fewer students in Boston public schools. My colleague Seth Daniel actually took a little deeper dive into that this week in this week's paper. And it turns out, some of the folks are going to charter schools, parochial schools. Archbishop Williams in Braintree, also known as Archie's, actually sends buses to Florian Hall to pick up students from Dorchester and Mattapan to take them to Braintree, and that's also playing out with buses for Betco kids too. So I think what we're seeing is parents are voting with their feet, and this is a long-term problem that's going to require a long-term solution.
Let's turn to another matter involving Mayor Wu, her meeting, which was pretty heavily hyped with Governor-elect Maura Healy. It occurred this past week, and there was a media availability afterward. Soraya, you covered this for us at GBH News. What, if anything, stood out to you about the way that the mayor and the governor-elect presented their conversation after the fact?
Yeah, Adam, I watched all of that less than 10-minute press briefing remotely. My big takeaway from that meeting is that for the next couple of years, if anybody in the press corps is looking for answers from either administration, they're going to have to wait until either of those two women are good and ready and absolutely clear about their talking points to hear from them. Right out the gate, we saw reporters asking about the two biggest issues that will require some collaboration from Boston City Hall and Beacon Hill, Boston City Hall and Beacon Hill, rent control and the sort of housing, mental health, substance use disorder that is Mass and Cass. Both women were brief and wary and unspecific in their responses to those questions. And that may very well be because they are genuinely at the beginning of working out what can be done, if anything can be done on those issues between the two. But again, that whole very brief press conference signaled to me that neither of those women is going to say anything that she's not prepared to say.
It could be because they're just getting started, but I've thought over the years of Mayor Wu as someone who chooses her words very carefully and parcels out information in a very selective and strategic way. And it seems, based on what we're learning about her communication style so far, going back to the campaign too, like Governor-elect Healy is going to be similar. Gin, this nascent relationship between Wu and Healy has gotten a whole lot of attention. I'm asking you too about it right now. But I'm wondering if it might be possible that how Mayor Wu and Governor-elect Healy get along is not actually going to matter as much, quite as much in the long run as the coverage might make you think. What's your take on that?
Sure. Well, I'm of two minds of it. On the one hand, I think there is some overanalyzing. I think that might be partly driven by the drought in terms of news that Healy has been providing about her transition. So, you know, the media hates a vacuum, and it's you know, so here we are talking about it.
Talk about something, yeah.
But you know, relationships are important. You know, I think when people don't get along on Beacon Hill, that means state budgets can fall apart, or you know that means money isn't going out the door. So relationships are incredibly important. You know, as Soraya noted, they're at the beginning of their relationship, and I think they will find common ground. I mean, you've got climate for one. Mayor Wu ran on the Green New Deal. Maura Healy, as Attorney General, sued Exxon, among other things, you know, in the name of climate change. The other thing is the MBTA. You know, Mayor Wu has lobbied for a seat on the MBTA board of directors, the oversight board. And one of Healy's big tasks when she comes in is picking a new leadership team and figuring out exactly how to restructure the MBTA if that's what she wants to do. So I think they're going to find some common ground. They're not going to agree on everything, but you know, their relationship will be important going forward for sure.
Again, keep the MBTA in the back of your mind because you wrote a really good piece for The Reporter that I want to ask you about in just a couple minutes. But before I bring that up, Soraya, there's a lawsuit challenging the Boston City Council's new redistricting plan. It's working its way through the courts as we speak. Who is objecting to the reapportionment of council districts or the reshaping of council districts, and what are they objecting about?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that got overshadowed when the city was kind of mired in its reaction to that Irish on Irish, really odious comments that came from the council floor. This lawsuit began as the council was attempting to pass the map that was ultimately passed and signed by the mayor. Robert O'Shea is chairman of the Ward 6 Democrats in South Boston. He's being represented by a former state rep, Southeast State Rep Paul Gannon. And they tried to halt the city council from even passing the map. The judge in Suffolk Superior Court threw that out immediately. Then we saw the case be expanded to add more names and expand the scope of complaint. And so now the latest thing is that the case has moved into a federal venue. So the case will be heard in the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts. The city moved the case, I'm told, because they by right can do it. And the next time that we hear anything in the case, it'll just be a scheduling conference, but that won't come until the end of January in 2023.
It's always tricky talking about legal proceedings, but what is the complaint exactly? Or tell me if I've got this right. My sense from afar, and I haven't covered this, I believe both of you have, but my sense is that essentially you've got community activists and some members of the council saying you're taking away core parts of the district that I either live in or that I have represented, and you're shifting them inappropriately to another district where they really don't belong. Is that a fair, broad brush characterization?
I think that is fair. I think there are competing complaints within the last thing filed from Robert O'Shea and the plaintiffs that the process was unfair for folks who don't speak English or are immigrants or live in public housing. I think at one point, one of the sitting members of the city council alleges that the map was shaped specifically to dilute white voting power in the sections of the city that have been historically white and exempt from being broken up.
And again, tell me again if I've got this right. There are complaints from people of color as well that are occurring in parallel to this, and a claim, among other things, that the voting power of residents of color in, I believe, Mattapan is being inappropriately diluted too. Have I got that right?
Yes, there are some folks who've signed on to it that are in Mattapan and unhappy with the new map.
Okay, so that being said, the lawsuit is being backed by 4 city councilors, all of whom I have come to think of as something of a bloc, Irish American, more conservative oftentimes, Frank Baker, Michael Flaherty, Aaron Murphy, and Ed Flynn, the council president. What does that opposition from those 4 tell us, again, about the way the council works today and what the balance of power on the council is?
Well, I think if we zoom out, we're probably going to see more and more 9-4 splits. Soraya broke the news about City Councilor Ed Flynn winning the presidency of the City Council, and that was in thanks part to Councilor Ricardo Arroyo, and his block of folks swinging over to his side. I think what we've discovered is that Flynn, who represents South Boston, might be the city council president, but is really Arroyo and his block's city council. I think that you're going to see votes again and again along those lines. We're going to see it in police reform. We recently saw it in police reform hearing on the police contract. The city council is much more progressive than it was 10 years ago. And it's just a very much different dynamic, including having to work with a progressive mayor.
Soraya, as divided as the council can be internally, I believe they voted unanimously this week, tell me if I'm getting that wrong, to change the way that the city of Boston encourages people to create affordable housing, the so-called inclusionary development policy. What is the council pushing for, and is the mayor likely to go along with their vision?
Yeah, we should preface this by saying that Frank Baker, the Dorchester councilor that at one point the Boston Globe affectionately dubbed Councilor No because of his tendency to be the lone wolf in votes, was not present. And so it's quite possible that unanimous vote may not have happened. But the inclusionary development policy, very shortly, because it's wonky, is leveraging private development to help solve Boston's housing crisis. It tells developers who are building more than 10 units, you want to build here, you're going to contribute some of these units to become income restricted in service of helping the city of Boston. Right now, the threshold that triggers the policy is 10 units. The Boston City Council would like for the trigger to begin at 5 units. In addition to that, there are some rules around when the income restricted units are made, the affordability levels that they're set at, and the city council, again, shortly, without getting into all the technicalities and terms, would like those units to be more deeply affordable at price points that reflect the people who live and work in Boston. The mayor, during her 2021 campaign, said that she was open to changing the policy in a different way. She said that she would be open to exacting more units for each development that is subject to the policy. The other thing that I need to note is that City Hall sources are saying it's pretty soon that we may see a policy of her own changing the IDP to reflect a way that she would like it to be changed after hiring a consulting firm to sort of study the issue in April.
Closing our conversation, again, I've got to ask you about a piece that you did, just came out a couple of days ago in The Reporter, sizing up the state of the red line in the heart of the city, in the parts of the city that your readers call home. How did you report this piece, and what did you find when you checked out the way the T is operating in Dorchester?
Sure. The impetus behind this was I realized I was writing a lot of little stories of just, a closure here, a staircase closure here, an entrance closure here. And I realized I was like, I need to zoom out. And I'm not an engineer. So I'll say
that's
that up
three
front.
of us. So yeah.
But I got on the red line and I just wrote it up and down, and I talked with some folks who are very frustrated with the state of the T. One architect who comes in from Ashmont every day, which is also one of the newer stations. He was expressing frustration that he feels like in the last 10 years, the red line especially has taken a step back after a lot of improvements. He said it feels like we're holding it together with baling wire and duct tape. And I think that's not just a feeling among riders, but it's also among T staff too, who obviously can't go on the record. But it's something that we have to keep an eye on, and it's a big deal when we know that Maura Healy is coming into power.
Well, it'll be fascinating to see what she does. Charlie Baker was infamous in some quarters for not riding the T. He said it didn't really matter. Healy is now conveniently located near the red line, so she can hop on and maybe take a look at what you found. Soraya Wintersmith, Gin Dumpsius, thank you both.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
For more than a century, New Hampshire voters have weighed in on presidential candidates before any other state primary voters in the country. And for more than a decade, New Hampshire's actually had a law in the books saying it has to go first. But now, ahead of the 2024 election, Democratic Party officials are moving to change that. At President Biden's behest, a group of Democratic National Committee officials voted in favor of a new schedule last Friday, putting South Carolina first on February 3rd, with both New Hampshire and Nevada following 3 days later. But the Granite State is not on board with the change, to put it mildly. And political leaders from both parties have made it clear they have no plans to go along with what national Democrats want. I'm joined now by one of them, president of the Manchester chapter of the NAACP, James McKim, and UNH political science professor, Dante Scala. Dante, let me start with you. Can we, because some of our viewers will be deeply familiar with what's going on here, some of them will be just getting up to speed on the story. The DNC's plan that I just described briefly includes a couple caveats. The DNC wants the state of New Hampshire to jump through a couple hoops to get that second primary spot, or tied for second primary spot. What are the hoops the DNC wants the state to jump through to get that position?
Yeah, the first hoop is that New Hampshire basically should make promises that they're going to adjust their laws, essentially the first in the nation primary law, which orders the elections officials in our state to move our primary 7 days ahead of all others, to adjust that law. That's one hoop.
Yep.
The second hoop is to make a promise to institute early voting in New Hampshire. And that's something we don't have. We do have same-day registration, so someone can show up on election day, register, and vote, but we don't have early voting as such. So those are two hoops that the National Democrats want New Hampshire to jump through. And on New Hampshire's side, there seems to be very little interest in doing either.
It's worth noting that the New Hampshire legislature is controlled by Republicans right now, correct?
Correct.
So you have the DNC ordering a Republican-controlled legislature to make changes that National Democrats want, and to do them very quickly, right? I think within a month or two. Have I got that right?
Right, exactly. I mean, this all has to be wrapped up by January, February. And an additional complication is that on the Republican side, national Republicans are perfectly happy with New Hampshire voting when it always has. So for New Hampshire Republicans, there's not only no urgency, there's actually the feeling is, why would we change in order to go along with Democrats want? Because our Republican primary is business as usual.
James McKim, I'd like to get your take on the wisdom of the DNC's proposal. The argument that DNC officials have made, and I believe President Biden or his surrogates have made, is one that we've heard over the years regarding New Hampshire, that the state of New Hampshire is not representative enough racially, ethnically, demographically, and that states that are more representative of the texture of the country as a whole should have an increased role in winnowing down the field of presidential candidates.
Right.
What's your thought on that reasoning?
No, I think it's interesting to look into a little more deeply what other state would be representative of the nation. And representative of the nation, as we know, the demographics of the nation are shifting just as the demographics of each state are shifting. So I think there needs to be a little bit more analysis of that. I'm not sure you're going to find a state that really is going to meet that criteria. And that's not to say that New Hampshire meets it better than any other. I think that there is the correct analysis that New Hampshire does not match the rest of the nation. But what other state would?
Well, let's talk just briefly about the two states that are going to be elevated here. By the way, under the DNC's proposal, it's worth noting Iowa would completely fade away, right? Iowa with their funky caucus system. So you'd have South Carolina and Nevada taking on an outsized role. South Carolina obviously has a high number of black voters. Nevada has a high number of Latino voters. James, do you think that just as a matter of principle, there is something to be said for giving black voters and Latino voters who traditionally haven't had the outsized influence on the winnowing process that predominantly white New Hampshire voters have had? Is there something to be said for giving them an increased role, do you think?
Well, this is an interesting question for me because I'm from South Carolina originally.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, perfect.
So it is a really interesting question. And I think there's this desire to be more representative that seems to, in the Democratic Party, be more about keeping the minority vote. And is that a bad thing? I think it probably is a good thing. The question is, how do we go about that? And is South Carolina the right state? And if you think about we were just talking about the fact that it's South Carolina and Nevada. So are you now setting up the black vote versus the Latino vote as a battleground for the Democratic Party? So it's interesting calculus that's going on, and I think putting the two states together is trying to address that fact that we don't want to pit those two races against each other as we go into the primaries.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up because I hadn't thought about I hadn't gamed out sort of the possible emotional implications or subjective implications the way you just did. And it's also worth stressing that the tactical drive here for the DNC. This is not simply necessarily something that's being done on the basis of principle or out of generosity or because they believe it's the right thing to do. There's a political calculus at play too.
Yes, absolutely.
Dante, can you
Adam, if I may
yeah, by all means.
If I may add on to James's point, South Carolina really dating back to Barack Obama's primary victory over Hillary Clinton back in 2008, South Carolina had already become, I think, the center of gravity for the Democratic Party's nomination process.
Yes.
And 2020 is a case in point. I mean, Joe Biden finished fifth here, and that seemed to spell doom for his eventual nomination. And if history had held, that would have been the case. However, he went to Nevada and then South Carolina, most of all. And South Carolina Democrats essentially vetoed New Hampshire Democrats' decision on Joe Biden. So it'll be interesting. South Carolina didn't want this, right? They certainly didn't expect to move up. And they were pretty happy, and for good reason, because they had become the kingmaker or the queenmaker, as the case may be, of Democratic Party nomination politics.
That's interesting. And also, the idea that going first is not necessarily as important or as decisive as people might think isn't one that I had fully considered. I want you to game this out a little bit more, Dante Scala. The DNC is threatening penalties for New Hampshire and for candidates who participate in New Hampshire if the state effectively, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, if the state goes rogue, if they say, no, we've got a state law, and even if you're not sanctioning it, we're going to hold our primary before these other states. What are the penalties they're threatening, and how likely do you think it is the DNC would actually implement them?
So we've heard about two types of penalties so far. One is a traditional penalty, which is that someone would be essentially that New Hampshire's delegates to the convention would not be seated, and that any delegates that the candidate candidate gains in New Hampshire would be either penalized, maybe you'd get half the delegates or maybe no delegates whatsoever. That traditionally hasn't worked well as a penalty because New Hampshire has so few delegates that actually go to the convention. New Hampshire's always been, the value of New Hampshire for a candidate has always been about the publicity the candidate gains by doing well in the national spotlight of the first in the nation primary. The second type of penalty is, to my mind, more drastic and could be more telling, which is, say a candidate comes to campaign in New Hampshire, signs up on the ballot, that the Democratic Party turns around and says, you may not participate in our nationally televised party-sponsored debates, right? So that denying candidates publicity, especially in the year before the nomination calendar officially starts, that could be a serious penalty that a candidate might well calculate into, her calculus about how much is New Hampshire worth it.
Yeah, that's a really serious penalty. James, I've talked with a few other people, in addition to you and Dante, about where this might lead. And there seems, based on my unscientific sampling, to be something of a sense of, the DNC is overreaching here, and New Hampshire is going to hold on to the first primary spot that it's had for a long time because this means a lot to us. The DNC is going to ultimately fail here. Do you have a prediction about how this is going to proceed moving forward?
I wish I did, because I'd be able to make a lot of money off of that. I think, as Dante mentioned, the fact that the Republicans don't care about this, and in one sense, I could almost see the Republicans weaponizing this against the Democrats, right? They're trying to force a state, and this also gets into states' rights versus the federal angle as well. So I don't think, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm just really interested to see all the discussions that are going to happen in the next few weeks about this.
Dante, what's your prediction, if you have one?
Yeah, I think the National Democratic Party is quite serious this time. And I think what we could wind up with in 2024 is, I still think New Hampshire is going to go first. The question is, who's going to be here for it? On the Republican side, as I mentioned, I think it's going to be business as usual. Candidates will come here and campaign and so forth. But on the Democratic side, well, one, we don't know if Joe Biden is going to be running again. If he is, chances are we're not going to have a competitive primary either. But I think there's a serious possibility that Joe Biden will not put his name on the New Hampshire primary ballot. He or one of his representatives will not come here because, again, it's real. Biden has laid down the law and said New Hampshire needs to get in line or else. So I'm hard pressed to see Biden coming here and going to the Secretary of State's office and doing all the traditional signing ceremonies that take place. So that's how I see it. On the Republican side, business as usual. But on the Democratic side, serious possibility that we don't see candidates here.
All right, we got to leave it there. Dante Scala, James McKim, thank you both. That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. And please tell us what you think. The email is talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. Or you can find me on Twitter. For the time being, I'm @ReillyAdam. For now, thank you for watching, and good night.